Шановні учасники,
So, dear participants, so we start the event. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us, those with us offline and online. So, my name is Maria Colos, and I'm the lawyer of the Center of Rule of Law and Democracy, and I'm responsible for money laundering, countering, and countering the financing of terrorism. And I will be the moderator of this event today. Okay, so just not to postpone even more with the start. So I would love to pass the floor for welcoming words. Pass the word to Ms. Olha Vasilevska-Smahluk, Ukrainian MP, Deputy Head of the Committee of Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine on Finances, Tax and Customs Policy, Head of the Subcommittee on Payment Information System Functioning and the Prevention of Legalizing the Illicit Assets. Committee of Verkhovna Rada on Finances, Customs and Tax Policy, Olga Mikhailivna. You're one of the drivers, the person who was driving the amendments to virtual assets regulation and crypto assets as well. And this issue specifically is of our concern. We will discuss to be or not to be for the market of virtual assets. Will it be or not there in Ukraine? Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much. This is really an honor for me to open this event today. It's really important for me to have cooperation with German organizations. We've did a lot together with the CED, and also just, I should note, of course, so my contribution in the draft law on virtual assets, it goes more for the following, for all the issues of countering money laundering, illicit assets laundering, actually to ensure that it is harmonized with the EU acquis. So I mostly was focused on IML sector of the virtual assets. Yeah, thank you so much. So to be or not to be, yeah, as you mentioned. It's very good naming, by the way. It's a very good choice for the name because virtual assets, they already exist. They already are there, People already use that. So it's a question for us how Ukraine can deal with that. What should we do with that? So when we were processing the draft law, we're actually brainstorming how to push the sector out of the shadow, how to make sure that we have transparent taxation, to make sure that we help our budget, first of all, and how to protect the rights of investors and at the same time, implement all international standards, in particular MiCA. So that's what we're actively doing now, with our parliamentary colleagues. That's the focus of our attention. The committee, it's a hard process, we suffer a lot. It actually really cumbersome. 10225D, this draft law got 1,000 of amendments, I guess. And we are now trying to shape the model of regulation. The National Bank duties and obligations and other bodies and agencies, those who are now competing to become the regulator of virtual assets in Ukraine. And actually, it is a proof of how important this topic is, how relevant it is. I do really hope that this discussion will help us to find some balanced, optimal decisions to help Ukraine build a civilized, legal, innovative market of virtual assets. For us to finally launch it legally, legal market to be their place. Because despite the ambitions, regardless of ambitions of various central executive power bodies, we still have to shape a model that will actually allow us to effectively regulate the sector, which is currently in a complete shadow, and it's throwing a shadow at our economy. So me as MP, we've had these conversations with our colleagues in the European Commission and in Europe, everybody's asking us, when shall we launch the market? And your contribution as an NGO, we really need this, to accelerate the process and to eliminate any possibilities. We really need to eliminate all the delays and to destroy and actually to eliminate any manipulations around that. Okay, so if our European colleagues that you've actually mentioned, those who wait for the virtual asset market to be launched, if we have our European colleagues with us, I would love to pass the floor now to Matteo De Simone. Policy Office of the General Directorate of European Commission on EU enlargement and Eastern neighborhood. Okay, do we have Matteo with us? Okay, I guess he hasn't joined us yet. If he joins later, well, he'll get the chance. Okay, so it's my pleasure right now to pass the floor to Taras Shevchenko, the director of the Center of Democracy and Rule of Law. Okay, Taras, I know that your integration is like your kink. Okay, so this draft law is super important in the Euro integration aspect as well. So please, yes, absolutely correct. Your integration is my kink, of course, but I'll be brief because these are just like welcoming words. So the core discussion is still there. So the fact that Ukraine has to complete the regulation and somehow handle the virtual assets, the EU enlargement report tells that, literally, specifically. This is one of the arguments, like, why should we do this? Of course, Ukraine needs that. It's not just the EU that is pushing it, but of course, the EU integration nuance, it somehow gives extra confidence that this will be pushed successfully in a joint dialogue. Ukraine took this course to regulate virtual assets back in 2022 by adopting the law on virtual assets. And this is a really good step, taken a good step forward, but still, it's definitely not enough that is done. By the way, the new report on EU enlargement, we expect to get that next week. And it's interesting, what shall we get in the text? What shall we read there? Because annual, EU may actually surprise us. Every year is different. So for the civic sector, virtual assets issue is important because it's about the source of funding. Many activists, many NGOs received money through crypto wallets and other channels, and their sources. Quite often we can ask ourselves, like, is it safe? Is it legal? Shall we later get some risks of prosecution or some criminal proceedings or any other negative consequences, So for the civic sector that we represent today, it's extremely important to have this clarity, with that matter. For our organization, for our center, it's really important also to have the dialogue, and it's so great that we have a chance to organize this dialogue between state representatives, engaging business, international organizations, and also the civic society. Therefore, I hope that we'll have a very productive event, a very productive discussion, and we'll have some solutions generated. Thank you so much, Taras. And, okay, Mr. Matteo De Simone, Policy Office of the Directorate General on EU Enlargement and Eastern Neighborhood. So he's with us. He has joined us. Matteo, you're so welcome with your introductory speech.
Oh, and just to make sure you can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Very good. And thank you, first of all, dear colleagues, dear friends, for inviting me to this event, event on this important topic. And thanks to SEDEM and the Center for Financial Integrity for inviting me. There is running jokes about the EU being a bit obsessed with regulating everything, and that's all it can do. So I'm afraid I will fulfill a bit the stereotype today, since I'll focus my remarks on the topic of regulation of virtual assets. And the reason I think why this is so important for Ukraine is quite clear. About 6 million Ukrainians currently use crypto assets, which places it among the world's highest rates of crypto ownership globally. As you know, the number of users has sensibly increased since the beginning of Russia's war of aggression. And it's perhaps in this context that virtual assets have demonstrated their potential, the positive potential, since they help provide a rapid and direct channel for donations, particularly in the early stage, to help Ukraine meet immediate and humanitarian and military needs. And I am aware that some of the organizers, including our hosts on the Center of Financial Integrity, have started looking at opportunities for virtual assets to play a role also in Ukraine's reconstruction. So there are several opportunities and definitely big dividends that can be achieved from the use of virtual assets. At the same time, the current regulatory gap surrounding this market in Ukraine presents serious risks to the financial sector, but also to its national security, and ultimately also to its EU integration prospects. I think you're very well aware that an unregulated virtual asset market leaves the door open to a number of problematic elements such as evasion of taxes, capital flight, laundering of proceeds of crime and corruption, illicit activities by organized crime, etc. You probably know that just a few days ago, law enforcement authorities charged a politician from the Poltava City Council with hiding nearly $5 million worth in crypto assets. So an unregulated virtual asset market is also a market vulnerable to exploitation by hybrid warfare, making it easier to evade sanctions, to funnel financial flows for the purpose of dual goods, or even for political destabilization. And it goes without saying that for a country like Ukraine, which is fighting a war of survival against a much larger aggressor, the financial losses of millions of dollars every month through opaque financial flows do represent a vital threat. It is clear to me that without sound regulation of virtual assets, there is a clear risk for Ukraine to become a regulatory black hole, a hub for the facilitation of illicit activities, transactions, including, and that's the most worrying element, those directed against its own national security and potentially against the one of its European allies. Talking of European allies, last September, the European Parliament adopted a resolution on Ukraine in which, among other things, it urged the country to regulate virtual assets, designate a supervisory authority, conduct risk assessment, and support the detection of financial crimes involving virtual assets. Also from our side, as European Commission, we underline the urgency for Ukraine to swiftly close the regulatory gap on virtual assets in line with the acquis. We indicated this in the screening process, which we recently concluded, both under Chapter 4 and under Chapter 24, which is part of the fundamental cluster, and therefore it also means that Ukraine included this in its rule of law roadmap with a commitment to align its legal framework on virtual assets with acquis and international FATF standards by Q2 2026. That is a very ambitious date, and it is coming up soon. We're talking about next year, and therefore I think we should see the adoption in first reading of draft law 10.22.5d as an important step, long-awaited step to meet international standards and internal needs. Its alignment with the MiCA regulation is definitely a first step towards meeting requirements of EU alignment, as well as the first initial elements that point at alignment with the DAC 8 directive on tax transparency. And these are, I think, reasons for optimism in spite of the remaining unclarity in some of the elements, like, for example, the one on regulators. Of course, every draft law can and probably should be further improved ahead of its final adoption, including elements like the previous speaker mentioned that are very dear to our civil society colleagues, which is the adequate taxation regime for non-profit organizations. However, from what I know, there is a very high number of amendments proposed in the Rada, and therefore there is a risk to slow down the process further. So we really hope that all MPs will ensure a swift conclusion of the legislative process in a constructive way, not to further delay the bill. Besides EU integration, you know very well that there is also the Moneyval reassessment coming up in 2027, which will reassess Ukraine's compliance with Recommendation 15 of the FATF, which was downgraded to partially compliant in 2020. And so this is one more reason for Ukraine to move without hesitation and introduce key elements like a licensing regime for virtual assets providers, clear and enforced requirements to perform customer due diligence and financial monitoring, maintain and share transaction records, cooperate across borders on investigations, and of course they should be in line with the obligations stemming from recent EU anti-money laundering regulations on crypto, in particular the TFR regulation on information that accompany transfer of funds in crypto assets. Finally, you are probably aware that the next national risk assessment on money laundering and terrorist financing is being prepared by the FIU. And no doubt this will confirm findings from its previous assessments about the risk associated with virtual assets. And these risks should be promptly addressed both at regulatory level, as I just discussed, but also by equipping all actors, so law enforcement, courts, FIU, anti-corruption agency, ARMA, financial institutions, and DNFBPs, with the necessary competences and tools to prevent, detect, and sanction a risk related to virtual assets. I think this would make Ukraine financially stronger, safer, and a more reliable market for investors and European partners. I'll conclude here, and I wish you all a very productive discussion. Thank you very much.
Дякую, Матео.
Thank you, Matteo. And I have to, emphasize that and highlight that we feel that EU, takes care about our Euro integration, our development, because this discussion is possible because of the generous support of European Union and International Renaissance Fund in the framework of common initiative joining together. But the Democracy Center is not alone in this projects, and I now give the floor to our partners in this discussion, Oksana Ignatenko, the Financial Director of the Center for Financial Integrity. Good morning, colleagues. I'm glad to see today so many participants in the room and online, and that's great to see legislators and private sector, civil society representatives, and together we can reach results. Colleagues today spoke about Euro integration, FATF standards, and I would like to say that another element which was highlighted by Matteo is also national security. Virtual assets are something which is more than complying with standards. They are important also because of national security issues. Yesterday in Vienna there was a 9th international conference on crypto assets, where European colleagues discussed the regulation in the world, financial investigations, and I would like to call on everybody today to keep up with these trends and not only prepare some common recommendations, joint recommendation, but also, look how can we gain that balance between regulation, financial security, upholding investor rights, and incentivizing companies to come to European market and work here. And so what conditions can we create for that? And also I would like to express my gratitude to our partners, to them, to donors who allow us to work in this sphere and work with such important issues. And I also would like to congratulate you all on the occasion of International Anti-Money Laundering Day. So that's great that we can discuss these questions today. So thank you, Oksana. It's definitely a very important day. So we are finishing with opening remarks, and I'm glad to start the first panel discussion. The topic is third edition. The vision of the virtual assets market in Ukraine is the hope for its launch. And I would invite the speakers to the panel who are present here with us in the room, Mr. Dmytro Nikolaevsky, Chief Legal Officer at the Project Office of the Ministry of Digital Transformation, and Vita Forsuk, PhD in Law, expert in taxation. So thank you for being today with us offline in the room, and also we have speakers online. Miss Olha Smahluk, I believe she's still with us, and Mr. Serhiy Rybchenko, Program Manager, Council of Europe, and a little bit later we will be joined by the Member of Parliament of Ukraine, Yaroslav Zhelezniak. But we are going to start, and I would like to give the floor to Olga Mikhailovna. Your committee, as you said, was a driver of this third edition of the draft law on virtual assets. Before we had draft law 10225, then 10225/1, and now we have 10225D. So what was the reason to create this third edition and leave the first two editions? And do you think is there political will to adopt this law and launch the market in coming years? Well, I don't say coming year anymore because situation is complicated, maybe coming years. So the floor is yours. So thank you. As Matteo said and other speakers during their opening remarks, we just don't have any other options but to launch the market. So yes, we really had many attempts because of several reasons. First of all, virtual assets are already regulated legally by many countries, but this legislation is not perfect because these assets, as we understand, are connected with several problems, including money laundering using virtual assets. So the first two attempts were, not successful. These draft laws were vague, ambiguous, and when the head of our committee joined this work, and I also express my gratitude to Vita Forsuk, who, shared her knowledge and contributed to the improved edition of draft law, and also our colleagues Serhiy Rybchenko helped a lot. So we together created more or less working version. To implement this law, we had to decide who will be a regulator. Do we need the dual situation in this issue, or do we need a single regulator? That's the issue number one. The second issue is amnesty issue, when people will disclose their crypto wallets, and we have to figure out, do we need this amnesty or not? It is stipulated in this draft law, but we are still working on this issue with our international partners. We also need clear rules of taxation to launch this system and push it out of the shadow. Now we are working on amendments to the tax code, creating rules of taxation of crypto assets for people and legal entities. Taxation is crucial for state funding, including armed forces funding, so we must incentivize keeping virtual assets in Ukraine and contributing to Ukrainian budget. So as for your question, do we have hope? We do have hope, because we have our responsibilities in work with, and obligations in work with our European partners. We must legalize this market. So, and I am not grateful to those members of parliament who submitted a huge amount of amendments, like amendment spam. We should have applied the existing experience of other states and create some sensible amendments. As for the timeline for law adoption, it's hard to say, because my task is thanks to Mr. Sergei Rybchenko, Mr. Matteo from the European Commission, push the adoption of this law from the point of view of anti-money laundering work. This draft law is quite good, and we synchronized our efforts with all the experts. We implemented the MiCA regulation using the experience of those states where the market is quite successful. Thank you, Ms. Olha, and I don't see if we have with us Mr. Yaroslav Zhelezniak. If he is not with us, I give the floor to Mr. Sergei Rybchenko. Mr. Sergei, you were mentioned a couple of times already by, so to say, kind words, and we do know that your experts prepared the technical report on this draft law, but maybe you can give us the broader frame on this draft law. What do you think? What are the risks which must be taken into account to avoid turning the market into gray zone and avoid, becoming gray zone for FATF? Thank you, Ms. Maria, thank you, Ms. Olga, for kind words, and I express my gratitude to participants, and I'm thankful for possibility to join you today. I will give a kind of retrospective view to see where we came from and answer Ms. Maria's questions, what lies in the future. So this draft law on anti-money laundering, fighting terrorist financing, and returning assets to Ukraine from abroad in the framework of European projects and programs. So I will be mostly speaking today in terms of anti-money laundering and terrorist financing issues. Well, from this point of view, from the point of view of AML, I would offer, to consider 2019 as a starting point, because in 2019, quote, the least known in the world but the most influential organization called Financial Action Task Force, FATF, extended their standards on MLTF standards to virtual assets and virtual asset service providers known as VASP. And it was the push for future development of AML policies and procedures in the context of the implementation of the 15th recommendation of FATF, but by civilized countries. This recommendation is key one in terms of today's discussion. Besides, 2019 is important for Ukraine because in 2019 the current edition of the relevant law on anti-money laundering and fighting terrorism financing was adopted, and which came into force in 2020. And this law, when it entered into force, should have broadened the umbrella on of MLTF to virtual assets and designating virtual assets as the objects of financial monitoring. The travel rule should have been implemented, and the Ministry of Digital Transformation was designated as the financial monitoring entity in Ukraine. So when this draft law was adopted and came into force, it looked as a timely and high quality basis for good oversight in the context of MLTF in virtual assets sector. So in this light, even the degrading of Ukraine's rating according to recommendation 15 by Manuel experts in 2020. So it was kind of a temporary misunderstanding, which could be corrected quickly because we have legal basis, and now we just had to implement in real life these norms, and everything would be all right. But it didn't happen, and since then there was no progress in terms of implementing the legislation in MLTF sector in the virtual assets market. So nothing happened. Bylaws were not prepared, and as of the recent years, if you have reviews on the financial monitoring service website, you can even find their virtual assets providers who manage to register there as the subjects of initial financial monitoring. So, moreover, when the relevant law came into force, the state entity who conducts financial monitoring, that is the Ministry of Digital Transformation, did not conduct any risk assessment, not in 2025, not in previous years. And as far as I know, in terms of preparation of current risks assessment, well, it wasn't done. So the state understands the risks and the state of affairs in this sphere, in the virtual assets market, and the usage of virtual assets for money laundering, terrorist financing, and illicit financial activity. So what could have happened if not for the war? Most probably the rate of Ukraine would have been degraded even more, according to recommendation 15 by the experts of Manuel, and the, well, sad prospects of being included into grey list of FATF in the nearest future. So, answering the question of Ms. Maria, what should we do? Well, the answer is quite simple. We can find it in thematic reviews of FATF, which are published annually after the implementation of the new edition of recommendation 15. So one of the steps, if we look at the recent thematic review of FATF published in the summer of this year, they offer to speed up implementation of risk assessment and implement risk-oriented approach for virtual assets and virtual assets providers. FATF says that many jurisdictions conducted the initial risk assessment in terms of virtual assets, and Ukraine didn't manage even that. And but anyways, effective assessment and risk-oriented approach is still the challenge for most of the countries. So FATF calls on jurisdictions who hadn't done it yet. Well, they call on them to conduct risk assessment in terms of money laundering, terrorism financing, propagation of WMDs. Well, that's important because Ukraine, since the beginning of full-scale invasion, which was mentioned already by Mr. Matteo and other speakers, Ukraine gets big funds transfers in virtual assets, in cryptocurrency, to fight Russian aggression, and that increases the risks connected with the use of virtual assets, and it requires the proper understanding from the regulatory bodies and legal law enforcement bodies of the situation. The other step, which is recommended by FATF based on the last review of their thematic report, is implementation of licensing and removing gaps in identification of virtual asset service providers. So they say that adoption of laws is not enough. A jurisdiction must license and register and identify physical persons and legal entities who function as VASPs, and mitigate and remove the risks from virtual assets provider who function in offshore jurisdiction. And also we must close the gaps in registration and licensing, which are connected with above mentioned facts. And FATF emphasizes on that, and that's important for Ukraine because we are now in the state where we have to adopt this relevant law in the first reading, and the legal framework is actively being updated, but still the future steps like adoption of this relevant legislation and registration of virtual assets providers and implementation of oversight models are important preconditions to be compliant with international standards in money laundering sphere.
The last thing I'd like to draw your attention to is strengthening the PPPs, the PPP concept and its enhancement. So this is something that, again, FATF is underlining and focusing on in its last review. And they actually offer, this is one of the steps to address those large-scale crimes that are committed either with the use of virtual assets or in the virtual asset environment. And if we strengthen the PPPs, well, it's so great that in this discussion we have also colleagues from the Financial Integrity Center, because this is one of their areas in to PPP strengthening to counter illegal use of virtual assets. This is one of a really very perspective streams or areas that will definitely help us to ensure that we meet the FATF recommendations and standards, as we call it, within the innovative technology area. So this is basically everything I wanted to deliver today. So thank you for this wonderful opportunity to join the discussion. I was extremely pleased. Miss Maria, thank you. Yes, thank you, Serhiy, so much. And I will go back to you with the second round of a question. So please don't just switch off, okay? Stay in touch. Okay. I don't see Yaroslav. I'm not sure if he's there, so we will go through the discussion. Dmitro, my question goes to you right now. So the state actually our state has not been like a freshman for quite a long time in the virtual asset landscape, as Serhiy already mentioned. For the defense need, humanitarian needs, we have these fundraising initiatives and the wallets, governmental wallets with the open data, so with $80 million, it reached that amount once, and even more. So there's no threshold. Nobody even has any hesitations. Nobody even has concerns that Ministry of Digital Transformation is basically a flagship and that you're ready to launch the virtual asset market, or VAM. So still, I've seen the response, and I've read the response of the Ministry of Digital on this draft law 10.22.5d. There are some precautions. Okay, I would love actually to talk about that specifically. Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the question. And this is one of our pains, let's say, and we're extremely happy that we have this opportunity to get this public space to express our opinions again, and to reiterate. But okay, one of the tasks of the Ministry of Digital, as we create the digital economy in the state per se. So we understand that without virtual assets per se, we cannot say that we've reached some progress in high quality digital economy establishment. Our citizens we have to make sure that our citizens are able to dispose of any digital innovative tools, to stimulate their activities, solve any problems with these, generate additional sources to pay taxes eventually, new businesses that must be established and registered, authorized in Ukraine, etc. So this is truly our ambition, to create this sector of digital economy in particular, to shape it. But you use the state concept, the word of state. State is not Ministry of Digital Transformation because we're one of the state agencies. And this process that we all are observing now, this is the collective process, okay? This is the co-creation where everybody's taking place, everybody's on board, all stakeholders are on board, everybody who has the competence and competent enough to actually contribute in certain streams, okay? In anything related to the regulatory framework establishment, I mean the virtual assets regulation. Therefore, it's not the adoption of law that we take, but the market establishment. It gives some extra challenges. It doesn't work like that. We cannot say, okay, market, you exist since now. You start existing since now, and we just like a magic wand, we just try to use for that. So it's not how markets are made. We need to have service providers, professional players there to have the market as it is. Not just with them existing, but when they have their clientele, when our citizens, Ukrainian citizens registered, when they are provided with services, when there is some registration, and when it's authorized. So all these things require various aspects to go through examination, and we need some expertise. So a person may be willing or not willing to dispose of some service provider in Ukraine when it comes to taxation, due to taxation. It's obvious for everyone that if a citizen uses the service provider, the VASP registered in Ukraine, tax agencies will be aware of all the operations and person will pay taxes. It's obvious. So the amount of taxes impacts the decision if the person is ready. If the person thinks that, okay, if I don't need that, then no. So all these things like the taxation, tax amnesty, all that goes far beyond the Ministry of Digital Transformation, far beyond our scope or mandate. So we cannot have that fast movement. We have to approximate that. We have to harmonize that. And how we do it's a very complicated process because various state agencies have different vision. And even that amount of amendments that actually was offered, 2,358, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, I'll give you the exact number. So if we speak of this number of amendments, this is itself a proof that there are people who are interested in slowing the process, like postponing the market establishment. We can call it spam, we can call it an opinion, we can call it differently. But eventually, in any case, we have facts on the table. So we have this number of amendments. If we have that, definitely they should be processed and analyzed according to the law. And the further movement is impossible without this. So what I'd like to tell you, what is my opinion on this? We've had so many working groups already. With that example, we can say that from our side, from the side of the Ministry of Digital Transformation, we never had a case when we were slowing something down. Okay, we're ready to process these amendments. We really want to push this slab forward, In 24/7 mode, we're ready to work. So we will eventually reach the result we desire when all of those who are somehow engaged in the process, those when their will and opinion shape the process, when they at least will be ready to work in 24/7 mode, maybe 16/7 mode, 8/7 mode, whatever. So when they actually give a lot of time and a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of resource and their professional expertise, when they contribute with that. So for this to be pushed forward, because this is really important. Out of the million of other opinions, just for the citizens, for the taxation, it's important. For the financial monitoring tasks, this is a systemic issue, and we have to handle that in a very concentrated manner. We have to be determined, we have to be pushy, and we have to stay consolidated. Upon the occasion, I would really love to invite all the stakeholders, all the subjects, please do everything to accelerate the process. Let's move faster within the track. And finally, let's get the edition that will manage to vote. Even in 2025, we can do that. It's possible. So technically, this is possible if we put enough efforts. Thank you. Okay, thank you so much. A clarifying question for me. Okay, I understand absolutely what your opinion is, and I do agree that it's a joint process, because if we want to launch the market, it requires all the stakeholders to be on board. Then it happens in the most optimal way, in the least painful way. But the vision of your experts, okay, then what is the optimal scenario? Can you just tell us about this? Okay, optimal scenario on what? On the market launch. For this to just go to space. Okay, the only way for us to launch the market is to create create conditions, environment where all the market players will be interested to play under these rules. Rules issue. Are these rules meeting the expectations, the reality, where all the players exist? This is a market thing. If a person doesn't want to, we don't have the tools to push the force and impose that and dispose of the any VASP registered in Ukraine. We're not in the totalitarian country. We don't have Stalin. People select the way and the manner for them to perform their business. We have to make them interested, attract them. So if we establish certain rules of the game, which will be fully acceptable for our business and for our citizens and feasible, this market will be launched. So we will not have this false start, that we have, that you talk about, because there's a chance to have this false start. We may generate some stillborn legislation, and it will not function. We can read in the news. Businesses are leaving Ukraine, teams are leaving Ukraine, developers, suppliers of services are leaving, vanishing. Some wallets are leaving Ukraine. And every time we hear that news, that piece of news, it's like it's a loss. We're losing something. We're not acquiring. We're not winning. We're just losing per se. So our key task, is not to lose something that is still there, and to create better conditions to actually multiply that and help them to evolve. The sector is really important for the country and for the economy. Thank you so much, Dmitro. All right, so Miss Vita, now it's you. We've heard a couple of times already that we need to somehow raise the interest of the market players, attract them, and we also mentioned that we need these discussions on the taxation specifically. So your vision now. So which tax stimuli we have and limitations in the focus of discussion, and basically which model, in your opinion, would be optimal? Because even in within 3 draft laws, there were discussions around that. Okay, look, the draft law on virtual assets, it seems to me it's a story of the largest amount of myths everybody's pushing around. Okay, so where's the question? If we start talking about the draft law, I've heard about so many amendments, more than 2,000, like something amendments. Look, don't take the number of amendments. We had draft laws with 15,000, 8, 10,000 of amendments. More than 2,000. This is a standard. It's okay for such a draft law. It's more or less okay, I'd say. If we take this draft law, if we read it, there are 4 blocks for any discussion. Taxation, everybody's focusing on taxation. Then civil and legal regulation, okay, where, as far as I understand, nobody's thinking about that now. Then regulation of providers and access to market. Investigations and the oversight, market oversight. This is Mika. Yeah, we all hear about. And the fourth block is partially OML right, establishment, trends and founds regulation, as we call it, and amendments in other draft laws. This is for the fans, let's say, in procedural codes on arresting the virtual assets in the wallets of providers and etc. Yeah. Nobody will even reach that block. And each of these 4 blocks, this is like a large, supermassive black hole, okay? So it's like Nietzsche, when Nietzsche told, you look at it and it starts looking at you. So when we come to taxation, the discussion has always been rotating around the rate. Let's be honest. Do you know what is the rate, a virtual asset rate now for individuals? Okay, I'll tell you. It's a secret for many, 5%. Why so? Because after we had virtual assets turned into a digital object, let's say the tax code started saying, okay, we have taxation of movables and immovables. You have to understand that property concept in tax code is different from the civil code. The tax code says property, including non-material assets or anything else. And basically now, digital objects and virtual assets are under taxation of immovable property. Do you see anyone declaring the operations with virtual assets with a small rate? Because in the discussion I hear they say on taxation they say God forbid, virtual asset taxes. Like, what is that? So why do we need to pay taxes from virtual assets? Okay, I've never heard any rational justification why it's not necessary. I've heard some emotional things, like people were talking about philosophy or religion, whatever. But nobody loves paying taxes. This is a universal truth, especially from wages, okay? But when we come to taxation model, look, what was the story? We have to understand that the draft law already has 2 vectors for individuals and the legal entities. For legal entities, it's the taxation of all operations, regardless of like crypto to crypto, crypto to fiat. For individuals, it's just so far the crypto to fiat. And it's simpler, it's easier. Because in Ukraine, why we took that option, because even in Europe, where they have operations, countries putting taxation of crypto to crypto, there's a problem of establishing the value. When you have the exchange operations, when the whole market is shaped within like 5-6 tokens, which are the most interesting ones. But there are so many others, like mem token, as they call, some trash, which is valuable today, not valuable tomorrow. It's hard to understand if you're actually getting income in those operations when you're exchanging, and what is the scope of that income. Second thing, when everybody's entering rate, okay? When it comes to draft law, again, you put like, you put the no and then you put the numbers. So we had these discussions about numbers in the second reading. MPs vote for that, they return after coffee, and then they like put some number out of thin air. But it's not about figures and numbers, not about rates. The largest problem is in the base. I give you an example. In the draft law now it tells that for individuals, we have to consider only the authorized token expenses. The terminology is wrong a little bit, because in the major part non-authorized tokens, but those tokens allowed for the turnover, and those which do not require permission. But anyway, you have to understand why it's important. Currently, there is an amendment to the draft law that tells that tokens within a certain list of countries, as far as I understand, countries that committee loved, I don't know, they took some random countries, they say that the tokens that were allowed to circulate they enter Ukraine automatically. Singapore, there are no requirements to public offers, just if these are financial tools, okay? With our logic, if these are financial tools, these should not enter the law and must be regulated by the draft law on capital market, on some banking regulations, I don't know. And then it goes that these tokens you bought in Singapore, in Ukraine, these are like automatically entering, but it's like you can consider those expenses or not. This will be, of course, a contradiction when you start talking to tax service in Ukraine. And they still require, if you were buying, some securities, they require you to give a certificate with a signature of the owner on your expenses. Signature in blood. And for you to get the certificate, when even you are writing to some American block, they say, okay, it's not the thing like $700 and I give you the signature. You'll get the certificate. So, for example, the discussion, like there are so many countries that introduced the taxation, and they've established a margin. They've split the speculative operations and operations when you use tokens as tool to save, to retain, diversify or retain the value. How do you think? Austria, Germany, up to 50% of rate, it may reach, okay, there. But if you get virtual assets, okay, if you keep these securities some loophole, within a year, it's not subject to taxation. So there's a high rate, but in general, it's still nice. The same was Portugal, that first they had the zero for operations. So the sale and purchase income, for example, but then they had to introduce it. This is like a separate story why they had to. But again, they use this idea. So when you use virtual assets, not as a speculation tool, but as a retaining tool, over a year, you will not have this taxation.
So Ukraine didn't want to do that. So we have a range of individuals' taxation. There is an amount which is not taxed, and the Minister of Finance agreed to this amount to be equal to one minimal salary. So even the cost of hiring a accountant to file the declaration will be higher than the tax you will have to pay. So this there are a lot of similar issues and questions there, technical questions and issues. For instance, there are some obscure issues like how do WASPs report your income. So they technically have MINICAF standard there, which describes the international information exchange in terms of cryptocurrency, like a CRS for cryptocurrency. So Ukraine has to implement that, and there are some numbers there as well. But what is the main issue with regulation of this sphere when we mention AML and so on? There is another issue, like centralized operations, where the providers are legal entities. And after MiCA was implemented in Europe, and at that time WASPs had to start actively be licensed, etc., and the system became more regulated, and we saw that a lot of players went into decentralized finances using DAO software. Well, there is a community, they decide what they do, they take some fees, but they are not even a legal entity and they have no responsibility. So according to MiCA, the work of these decentralized operators is not regulated, and it will be also a challenge for Ukraine. In Europe, situation is different because tax authorities see all the movements on your accounts. There is any funds entering your accounts are taxed. For Ukraine, it could be a challenge because if standard legal entity WASPs will submit information to tax authorities, and in other situations our people don't like to pay taxes. We see this situation with tax amnesty. People can't show, even they don't want to show how their cold wallets received some funds from some small operators, and we have another issue here. When we speak about access to market, Dmitro speaks about the establishment of the market. I guess that's the wrong term, market establishment, because even in the plan economy, market was not formed by the state. Well, it forms itself. So regulation is like limiting the market. So currently, we have a market which established itself. It was formed without any rules, and now we try to limit it by the ghetto of rules. So now in Ukraine, according to civil code, we can do whatever we want. Well, WASPs had to undergo financial monitoring. Well, and that's all. And please tell me, do you see a lot of WASPs in Ukraine who can operate officially? Actually, no. All of them say that they are still waiting for tax rate, for proper clothes, for whatever. I believe that the problem is not there. When we speak about some simple issues, some simple problems in Ukraine, which they don't have in Europe, it's the free movement of capital. We understand that the European Union is built on the principle of free movement of capital. In Ukraine, when we have war, we cannot afford to have free movement of capital. That's the problem of National Bank of Ukraine as well. Well, maybe colleagues from National Bank will have another opinion, but I guess that they're so cautious with these tools when people say, let's launch that, let's not have any barriers. Well, they're very cautious because they need to establish some limitations for transfers to WASPs and further transfers to other WASPs in Europe, etc. Can we prohibit that? That's a problem. So in reality, that's not a question of people not wanting to work 24/7. No, we do want to work hard, but there are a lot of issues and problems which cannot be solved by simple technical discussions and decisions like we go left or we go right. There are a lot of issues which depend on, well, how we decide to work with our financial system, with cybersecurity, well, etc. And the tax rate is not the most important issue here. So thank you. You well, set a wide frame of issues which are connected with future possible taxation and tax rate, and we can even organize another discussion on taxing or not taxing virtual assets. Well, look, it already exists. That's not the question of whether you want it or not. The legal entities are already, well, taxing that. If they have work with virtual assets, they have to mention that in financial reports. You can use the regular accounting standards. And for individuals, as there is a taxation of movables already as well. So we don't speak about new taxes. We actually speak about tax benefits, tax exemptions, and also we have an issue of tax basis. Well, you can do that using virtual asset service providers. They just set the fee as income. They're just some issues of accounting. They don't have to invent any new rules like the lottery operators who have to do something special. Well, we don't speak about special taxation of providers, not in Ukraine, not in the world. So thank you. A short remark from colleagues. There was a great metaphor with fences. In the Ministry of Digitalization, we try to build roads, but some people want to build fences. And when different structures try to solve the same problem in different way. It's very interesting. Thank you. Thank you, Dmitro. And at this stage, we can give the floor to Mr. Yaroslav Zhelezniak. So I've read your interviews on this third edition of law, and your task is if I understand it correctly, so your task was to find a compromise between fence and Wild West. So my question deals with did you manage to find a compromise between parliament and business community on the regulation of this area? We see that there are more than 3,000 amendments to this draft law. So, what do you think? Will it be possible to find optimal model, perfect law text which will take into account interests of all stakeholders? Well, let me start with a joke. So our government is not good at building roads, and fences are not perfect as well, as we see from the results of some officials' work in the energy sector. So I believe that we will be able to find a compromise, and I guess that we don't have too many points of conflict in that law, unlike the many laws which are adopted in Ukrainian parliament. If we simplify this discussion, which is based on the question of regulating body, and we have different views in committee, international partners have another views, National Bank has its own view. And the second question is the issue of how liberal would we be in the standards, and how far would we depart from MiCA standards, etc. Personally, I'm on the side of the Ministry of Digital Transformation, and a lot of those 3,000 amendments are submitted by me because we couldn't find common grounds on the previous stages, and we decided that it would be better to continue arguing and working on law in the second reading, not waiting for some years. But still there are things which are viewed differently by different actors. Well, starting from the conflict of interest, because different regulators have different views. There are some ideological differences, but I believe that all stakeholders are more or less adequate and want this law to move to adoption. There is also a question of regulation of virtual issue, and it exists for many years, and it's a very old question. So, as far as I understand, the business position is that we should adopt anything at last. A law or several laws were adopted, but it's still not working, and law enforcement bodies are coming to us and asking for some illicit transfers. So we want to pay to state budget. We don't want to pay bribes, says the business. So if we could summarize, I guess I can say that when we have a decision of regulating body, there are different views. The IMF will submit their opinion on that. I've heard this from my colleagues from coalition. Well, after that, we will move forward quicker when we have the regulator, because that's the basis of the draft law. And after that, we the colleagues know it will be a long process. One question can take up to hour with arguing, etc. So I mean the issue of this more or less liberal approach. So, and it could be our competitive advantage comparing to European countries. So thank you so much, Mr. Yaroslav. So your prediction on the issue of regulator is that most probably the regulator will be the National Bank of Ukraine. Do I understand you correctly? Because we have consulted with many colleagues and there are different views on the nature of virtual assets. There were even, well, proposals to include the Ministry of Culture in regulating this sphere when there are some tokens connected to cultural heritage. But you prognose that it will be National Bank of Ukraine. Well, I guess that Ministry of Culture should start doing at least something. They want to create thousands of hours of content with taxpayers' money. Well, it would be great for them to, well, do it correctly and avoid some troubles like it happened previously, and after that they can say something about virtual assets. And as for the regulator issue, I believe that the decision will be well, quite without any surprises. I guess that the best model is to create a separate regulating bodies. It would be the best option because all the previous experience of loading more responsibilities to some entities, to some existing regulators, such approach is not efficient. And accordingly, in this case, if we could fast forward to 2020 whatever year, and if we have time, I guess that the best decision would be to create a separate regulator. It may sound like a joke, like the Central Bitcoin Authority or something like that, if you treat it from that angle. But I guess it would be the best decision. I trust the Ministry of Digital Transformation. I see the will from their part to have this market developing. But in reality, we are at the end of 2025, and at this stage, I don't believe that even if the law is adopted, we would be able to manage to create regulator in time. I guess we missed that time. So we still have a choice between two institutions, the Securities Commission and the National Bank of Ukraine. So we have the binary decision, and here the commission, the National Securities and Stock Market Commission, comes to help. They were present at our recent meeting on the virtual assets. The head of the commission was present, and well, in the end, they decided not to participate in working groups anymore, some way. So we don't have too many options, and the same position was submitted by the IMF, and the same position, as far as I know, is represented by the majority members of parliament, because I represent opposition, as you know. So I guess that, well, the policy is formed not by them, but the office of the president. So anyways, if the National Bank will be regulator, okay, we can work with that. There is only one problem. Some part of the law was well drafted in the form which is suitable for the commission, and I'm grateful to people from the commission who helped to do that, to the colleagues who contributed to that with their time and effort. So it's a shame that their work will be wasted, but still we can rewrite that part aimed at the National Bank as a regulator, but at the same time it would be great to hear the position of National Bank on that question now. And this position should be provided quickly. Thank you, Yaroslav. Actually, the colleagues from National Bank are present only in the audience today. We tried to invite them as speakers, but I guess that we will be able to present them as speakers at some later events. Also, Miss Olga, I would like to come back to your sphere, AML and terrorist financing risks. So, in this sphere, we are not afraid not of taxation of virtual assets, which we already use, and we have the similar position with the colleagues from the future panel, which is adopt anything to start the work, but we have the problem with defining the risks for NGOs, non-profitable charitable organizations, etc. We'll definitely see the results of national risk assessment, which will be finalized this year if everything goes well, but still the previous two editions highlighted the high risk level for virtual assets in terms of NGO work, and we have concerns that if two risks are combined, we won't be able to move in any direction. And one of the proposals, which we, for example, provided according to vision which we have. So the problem is that the draft law existing in this edition doesn't mention the use of virtual assets by non-profitable actors. Well, maybe there is a possibility to regulate that by law, or maybe we can add that provisions into the law itself. In any case, we are for transparency in this law, and we offered to introduce something similar to the register of volunteers, which will be the register of wallets of NGOs and charitable organizations. It could be open registry using the blockchain technology, which will guarantee the transparency of data connected with those wallets, transactions, incoming, outcoming, and it will allow us to minimize the risks which could arise. So what's your position on that issue? Can we do something for civil society for us not to worry and keep working? Because even in the first year and a half of full-scale invasion, there were some donations in cryptocurrencies and crypto tokens, and we received more than $200 million in cryptocurrency according to open data. So that's a considerable resource which allows us to survive for all of us as a country, not as a civil sector.
Miss Olha, unfortunately, you're muted. Yeah, sorry. Yes, this is a relevant question, and we do cooperate. We've been cooperating with you on the CSOs and charitable funds and how to regulate their activities to make sure that we counter the terrorism and illicit financial activities and virtual assets as well. The level of risk is established not only in Ukraine as a state for those kind of organizations, but for the world when it comes to their financial activities. The draft law that we are discussing today is implementing international FATF standards. The core standard is there, and this rule is added as 14.1 that is added to the law on prevention. So this clause requires all the transfers of virtual assets via the VASPs for example, the stock markets actually, to be supported by the verified information on the one who sends and the one who receives. And it establishes the mechanisms of control, obligatory verification, procedure of termination, and responsibility for the subjects that do not provide information. In the draft law, we wanted to focus on operations with the addresses placed autonomously. There is a version in the first reading. And in this chapter, we already established a requirement that with amounts of more than 45,000 hryvnias transferred, there must be control over the wallet to minimize the risks related to the wallet anonymity. It's not enough. That's why for the second reading, I will add another amendment. That will be reflected, I hope. It will be adopted, I hope, and integrated in the new Article 14.2, strengthening measures of proper examination of the client in case of transferring virtual assets for the independently placed address. So this amendment actually is intended to introduce these strengthened measures of due diligence for all the operations with all these independently placed addresses. So the subjects of monitoring according to that proposal, like stocks, will actually not just design their internal policies to assess risks of those operations, but also take specific strengthened measures. Identify, verify not only the client oneself, the receiver, not only the receiver, establish additional information on the origin and the purpose of these transferred assets, virtual assets, and strengthen the monitoring, permanent monitoring of these financial transactions. So I think, well, I don't want to bring any bad news, especially at the civic society platform. With separate registries of CSOs, we will not be able to enhance and improve the regulation in the sector, specifically for those organizations, because this contradicts completely all the standards, okay? So I'll remind you that there was similar initiative on PEPs when they wanted to have the PEPs register. But it doesn't work like that. It cannot work like that, because it itself is violation of the whole philosophy. It destroys the whole philosophy of money laundering. Yes, the rules will cover everyone. This is my personal opinion. If we'll manage to achieve some consensus and exception for the civic society, I will not say no. I will not be against that, but I understand that we have those that will be against this. Again, everything we can now do in this draft law is establish a golden standard reflected there as it is. And later in bylaws and in the process of implementation, we will be able to speak about something, but only if we have specific cases, specific examples, when some operations are blocked specifically for the CSOs, and these operations are clear. So this is still a specific thing, because I do respect you so much and appreciate your work, but there is still a requirement and standard we cannot violate. Tomorrow, after CSOs, we'll have PEPs coming and start dropping tears here and there. So we cannot allow that to happen, unfortunately. Thank you so much, Olga, Vita. Yeah. Now, if a charitable fund or CSO gets any donations in virtual assets, one should demonstrate it in the financial report. The thing is that there are two stories. Theoretically, there are CSOs with custodial wallets opened for the CSO specifically. The second thing is when these were private wallets of individuals where they received donations. And then they said, oh, we use it for some public charitable activity. These are two very different things. When I speak about the first option, it's clear, it's adequate. So CSO or charity fund, whatever, nonprofit, nothing obstructs you to actually put in a financial report, make a note, yeah, just to reveal this information and be transparent. But in many cases, we took a second option, and then truly tying these private wallets of individuals to some CSOs, then there are so many questions that go to the surface. So individual should actually put all those incomes under taxation and the rest. Again, coming back to our favorite amnesty issue. Okay, if our legislation currently requires some info, to reveal some info about virtual assets, yes, we had it in the law, it's already there, but it's not perfect. Because these wallets that Olha is mentioning, we don't have these safe hosted ones. So this is the largest problem. The wallets that I told you about. The problem with the TFTR, it's not just about public sector. TFTR is built for centralized things. Okay. The other thing, when centralized VASPs will work with decentralized ones, and we will need to build internal systems of risk assessment. Because the question is, not all decentralized stock markets they stick to financial monitoring rules. This is a large problem for FATF because they started assessing and verifying all that with the decentralized finances. And the question is, again, interaction between the cold ones, when your operations are taking place beyond the provider, the authorized provider, okay? From the cold wallet to the cold wallet, from the private to the private. Okay, FATF is doing a lot for this anonymity of wallets that previously we spoke of. In blockchain, we don't have anonymous operations, but you need to know who that belongs to. If you know whose wallet is, you can see the transactions. So no special registries. Well, you don't need any special registries. You need just to have your financial reporting done properly. Okay, you need to open your wallets in custodials. Yes, and show this is my custodial wallet. Anyone via an analytical program, you'll see, and all the transactions and what happened later. And that's why nobody is inventing the bicycle, and there are no special rules in the draft law. Nobody was putting it there. Miss Vida, thank you so much. I really hope that that would be enough, because we as public sector, civic sector, we've had so bizarre cases, not only with the virtual assets, but like with some clear fiat system. We've had those when just out of nowhere, we can get the account problems for a couple of months. Yeah. So now we are being overly cautious. But thank you still. Thank you. Okay, Serhiy, if you're still with us, if you're still with us online, of course. Yeah. Amazing. Serhiy, how do you assess in general maybe some other recommendations we can get from your technical report, something that should have been integrated in the second reading, yeah? And the second question, we've heard that already, and we know we've heard it from Matteo already. We know that currently we have this joint mutual assessment in the following year, and your integration process is also about regulating the virtual asset market. So by the ambitious 2030, it can be postponed till 2030. So your forecast, what the problem will be if we just get stuck in the first reading with this draft law at the moment of assessment. Assessment starts in 2026, by the way. Yeah. As far as I understand, this is quite a cumbersome, long process. Thank you so much for the question. Again, first question. When it comes to recommendations to the draft law, well, we didn't work with the existing draft law because we had requests from colleagues to help them at the stage when the committee was only drafting their paper, and we consulted them on some issues related purely to specific issues. So after that, we didn't have some additional work because the majority of recommendations we've provided, these were considered at some point. But revising after the first reading or before the second, there was no such request. And this is quite a difficult task due to technical reasons, because in the vast majority of cases, this is done by international experts. Respectively, 300 of draft law, you have to translate it first. You have to find the experts who will actually be so much inspired and enthusiastic to read that and assess, because we cannot purely look at those chapters and clauses that amend the law on money laundering and financial terrorism. We need to assess it comprehensively, like thinking, how shall it function in LMCFT context? Therefore, there's nothing to add to what was already discussed. In the context of future assessment, well, this is a big thing. Why in my speech I mentioned the national risk assessment, NRA, because NRA we haven't, it will be the foundation that we have now. It will be the foundation for Ukraine's assessment by experts in 2027. Therefore, if we don't have, and I don't know, maybe colleagues from the State Fin Monitoring Service will correct me, or colleagues from the MOF, but as far as I know, in 2025, there was no risk assessment this year. So in the national risk assessment, we will have, it's highly likely what they say, the gap, what they call the gap, putting it politely, and explaining it at the stage of assessment by international expert, by the Committee of Money, well, it will be hard to explain. So if you take a closer look at the report on progress, again, I referred to that of 2020, yeah? Right after we adopted the new version of the law, you will see that, yes, the assessment team clearly noted that the legislation was adopted and it implements the part of international standards, but without proper implementation, regardless of if in 2027 we already have the special law adopted or not, the key question will be the following: how was Ukraine integrating those international standards, which are the subject of our obligation? Law is the prerequisite, an important one. But from the standpoint of assessment, this is just one of the steps eventually. So truly the process of assessment is a long one. It takes approximately a year. And as of now, this round of assessment is taking place under the updated methodology of FATF. If you're interested, you need to check that, and please read. Look how they shifted the focus from technical compliance, the availability of legislative acts and bylaws, but they shifted to effectiveness now. So they even focus more now in the assessment on effectiveness. And it will be really hard to show effectiveness demonstrated, even with the adopted legislation, if by the moment of assessment it's not still applicable. Or if we don't start doing something that we've been obliged to under this legislation. I speak about the money laundering and financial terrorism law. Yes, thank you so much, Serhiy. Dmytro. Final question goes to you. What has to be, like, let's say, polished in this draft law? What should be still cleared? Maybe some specific offers already there. Like, what should be polished? Cleared and polished. Okay. And that amount of amendments in that huge 2,000 something, approximately 50 amendments we have from our ministry, 34 to the core law, and the rest to taxation part. These mostly refer to initial phase of the market launch, where they offer where there's an offer to minimize some requirements for the service providers to shape their clientele, core clientele and their liquidity, for this market to become functional. Ideally, well, there are even some deadlines given, let's say, like how should that be synchronized in future with those requirements that we have in the MiCA. So fully, we offer our amendments. There's an intention to create a transitional period, a sort of that. Even Vita spoke of Portugal, you know, when there was like zero tax. It wasn't just, it wasn't the gold era, the Gilded Age, okay? It was just the inception, you know, the starting point for the market to be launched. And when it's already shaped, rules can become harder, stricter, and this is a clear thing. The whole EU, and we will become eventually part of it. They also had eventually this starting point, inception period, when they had other rules, or there were no rules basically, but the banking system was giving a chance for VASPs to register to use banking system. They had large European stock markets established, and then when they made some money, they were able to allow a higher compliance level, and MiCA itself is about more effective compliance, stricter compliance. It's more about protecting the consumer's rights. So they had these iterations. All our amendments from the Ministry of Digital, these were purposed to establish this transitional period for Ukrainians as well. Thank you, Dmitro. Respectively, Vita, a question to you. Maybe a remark on the transition period, but okay. As we checked the draft law, as we read the text, so the following question comes out of here. Of our concern is the vague list of operations with virtual assets. We hear about operations, but which operations? Quite ambiguous, okay? Second question on the regulator. Regulator is able to identify, it says that one might identify the types of virtual assets.
So how is it treated in terms of taxation? Well, look, the first question I can answer in such a way. The draft law defines operation only for the purposes of identifying VASPs, like separating providers. In other parts, for the purposes of taxation, there are only two types of operations which are interesting: crypto to crypto, crypto to fiat. The other cases are not so interesting. There was also issue of certain operations. How should they be taxed with VAT? In most cases, that's responsibility of providers, and that's also a specific topic, because there are two problems here. First, overall, the taxation of financial operations is not harmonized with Directive 112, and European Union also didn't provide some specific rules under this directive. There are some two draft documents, and they're finalizing them. So some specific rules will be introduced, and that's our internal topic. When we go to the next question, like the regulator defining some kinds of operation, we had this discussion before the first reading, during the creation of the law. On this stage, there was a classification of assets according to MiCA. In that draft law, there were asset reference tokens and money tokens, e-money tokens. So there were specific categories defined in MiCA, like some service tokens, NFTs. NFTs, by the way, are not regulated by MiCA unless they are not collections. So MiCA regulates admission to public supply of that tokens. So some kinds of tokens were defined, some tokens were described in more details. I had an offer to add decentralized currency there. So at the preparation stage, the head of committee said that we don't need that. So why do we need that? He offered leave that to regulator. And that led to the situation when NFT terms were introduced in taxation part. So look, some things arise from time to time, and I believe that by the second reading all of that will be fixed, because that classification is needed, because we'll need that for civil regulation of civil legal issues. It is needed in that draft law because we have issues with legal acts like smart contracts, etc. At this moment, the position of head of the committee is as follows. Why do we need this civil regulation before the creation of smart contracts? It will be regulated later in another law. To my mind, it's a different story. The law says that this new law of regulation of virtual assets must regulate all of these issues. Well, I believe that it was an attempt to postpone this issue, like we'll fix it tomorrow. But anyways, before the second reading, we must solve these issues, because we won't be able to start normal work on the private level. For example, a person has a smart contract, but the tax administration requires some papers from you. Well, smart contract could be part of some legal action. There could be different situations, and in this case, we could use the document by Unit Out, who published a guide on public regulation of virtual assets. Well, we can borrow something from there to the law, to the draft law. So again, if we leave behind us some difficult political questions like the choice of regulator, the oversight mechanism, because every regulator has their own formed procedures of oversight. We have a lot of technical issues and questions, because which seem like the issues which can be solved later, but like we constantly ask the civil society to take a look at these drafts, because there could be different opinions which could change everything, like in the profit tax, in the first version of this draft law submitted by Ministry of Finance, there was a proposal to have the approximate list of expenses of individuals, and now the Ministry of Finance says that it should be a list. So what does it change when you leave out the word approximate? It means that before the list of documents for legal entities is not adopted and approved by Ministry of Finance, before that you cannot add any expenses in your reports, even referring to accountancy laws, even some specific issues of accountancy laws. So it's very complicated situation. The small changes could have huge consequences. So I don't trust that we can solve all of that by the end of the year, or we can do it and then postpone the difficult questions for later stages. Thank you. We do have such feeling as well that there is still much work to do. I am grateful to all the speakers, and we have some time for Q&A. I don't see many questions in chat, but if there are some questions offline or online, if there are people who want to ask something, I guess that our speakers will gladly answer any questions. So I don't see questions offline, and I don't see questions online as well. So I guess that we can finish this panel for now. I'm grateful to Dmitro, to Vita, to Sergei, as well. I'm grateful. Mm, Unfortunately, Mr. Yaroslav and Miss Olha already left us, but we'll thank them in written form, and we have now a break till 13:20. That's the information for people online. After that, we'll have a next panel dedicated to more expert vision, a vision of private and public sectors, of users who will be actually working on that market. So thank you and stay tuned.